Hello. Today, I'm dreaming of a trip to Italy, France. Or maybe I mean France, Italy. Whatever, it's all made up anyway. Welcome to the good world.
1, 2, 3.
So come on in to a place that is fun. I'll be your friend and you can be mine. The world is a stream of constant bullshit, but that doesn't mean there's not a whole lot of good shit. You spelled it to me and we can make something different. Let's build a world that is good.
This is a show for adults. Hello, friends. Welcome to the good world. My name is Seth. I am a soon-to-be ordained interfaith reverend. Thank you for joining me today. So, if you watched my last episode, you know that my wife's grandpa Steve died last week. And so we traveled down to Santa Cruz to be with Susie's family. And we were there for a week, and it was obviously a really emotional visit. So Susie and I decided one day we would go out for lunch, just the two of us. We could sort of take some time to check in with each other and have a spouse moment. And so we went to a restaurant called Mentone, I don't know, but I'll link to it below. But it's a pizza place. It's like really high quality pizza. But so it's named for a town in France called I'm guessing it's pronounced Menton in French. Menton. And I know you are thinking, but Seth, you said it's a pizza place. Why is it named for a town in France? So, Menton is right on the border between France and Italy along the Mediterranean coast here. I'll put up a map. Hi friends, just interrupting because I'm editing this, and I just want to note that I couldn't find a map that really worked for what I wanted to do, so I wrote some code to make this map, and I just wanted to take a moment to pat myself on the back for that. It's a very pretty map. Okay, back to the show. That's Menton right there. As I said, I think it's pronounced Menton in French, and it's called Mentone in Italian, probably. I'm probably pronouncing that right-ish. But it's a border town, and what is interesting about it to me is that it's actually been a border town for around 700 years. And so just for context, that is actually a lot longer than France or Italy have existed as countries. 700 years ago, Menton, I'm just going to say Menton. It sounds like a little less silly than me speaking in bad French. Menton was on the border it was the county of Nice on one side, which was ruled by the House of Savoy. This was the side of the border that is now France today. On the other side of the border was the Republic of Genoa, which was its own country and which is now the Genoa region within the larger country of Italy, right? Pasta Genovese, or pesto, basil, that Genovese, anything comes from Genoa. Also, I just realized that the word county must have originally meant an area of land ruled by a count, right? Like a kingdom is ruled by a king, a duchy is a duke, and a county, I guess, is a count. Had not occurred to me. Wild. Anyway, okay, so why am I talking about the history behind the name of a pizza place in Aptos, California? Like, I'm not even talking about the pizza place anymore, right? I'm just talking about the place it's named for. Why am I doing that? And the answer is I want to talk about border regions. And so for anyone who's watching this, you and I have grown up in a world where borders are like pretty definite and consistent things, right? For the most part, like here's a map of Western Europe, and here is France, and that's Spain, that's Italy, Germany, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. We can keep going. Apologies to the rest of Europe for not doing that. But we can think of all of these places as like a clearly defined thing, right? Like we think about France and we have an image in our head of like cafes and croissants, and we think we know what France is. And we think about Italy and we think of pasta or the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And we kind of forget that all of these countries are actually like pretty new in the grand scheme of things. Like when the Tower of Pisa was built, and it wasn't leaning yet at that point, but Pisa was its own republic, just like Genoa was a republic and Florence was a republic. Italy was a bunch of different small republics. And Italy itself has only been a country since the 1860s, right? And both Italy and France have not had their current borders for even 100 years yet. And so we think of borders as these like absolute and definite things. But throughout human history, borders have moved as much as people have. And people have moved a lot. Susie's family is actually a great example of this. She's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which Ashkenazim is the plural, are Jewish diaspora whose ancestors ended up in Central Europe, as opposed to Sephardi Jews who ended up in Spain and Portugal, or there are also Mizrahi Jews who ended up in the Caucasus and North Africa, lots of different diaspora Jews. Because again, people moved around a lot, not always by choice, often very much not by choice, and that's a whole other thing. But so on her dad's side, Susie's family are Ashkenazi Jews, like me. And on her mom's side, she is Mexican. And pretty much that whole side of the family lives in California. Some of them are down in Southern California, some of them are in the Bay Area, they're all over the place. And so if you are like me, when I first met Susie, you hear that her mom's side is Mexicans living in California, and you think that that means that they were immigrants. But you, and formerly I, would be wrong, because they didn't move across a border. The border moved across them. They were living in California when it was part of Mexico. They were still living in California when it became part of the U.S. And actually on her mom's side, her family lived out here in California before the Spanish even showed up and called it California. So the people didn't move, but the border moved a few times, right? And so again, we have this idea of borders as like fixed and permanent, and that has been mostly true in my lifetime. There are exceptions. The former Soviet bloc is a very big exception, but there have been others. I looked it up. I will link to a Wikipedia article here. You can look and see what borders have changed in your lifetime. I was born in 1982, so anything you see there that's 1982 or later is during my lifetime. And so I mentioned Menton, right? And that is a place where the border has moved a bunch of times. Just in the last century, Menton has been part of France and part of Italy. And before either of those things, it was part of Monaco. They're squishy. And here's why I'm talking about the squishiness of borders. So borders are a place where cultures meet, right? And so a place like Menton culturally is, at least as I understand it, it's kind of a mix of French and Italian cultures. Right? Historically, it's been Italy, it's been France, and so ultimately it's kind of Italy, France, but it's also its own thing, because everywhere has its own local culture too, right? And lots of border regions are like this, especially in places where the borders aren't that old, but everywhere. Susie and I, a few years ago, we went to the eastern part of France, right? And a lot of it's kind of Germany, France, and it's also its own thing. Like you get an influence from France, you get an influence from Germany, and you also get the people who have been living in the specific place with the specific ingredients that grow well where they live and the specific climate that lends itself to making things specific ways. And so this kind of thing happens all over the place. In border regions, people can learn from each other, they can create with each other, and the result is something entirely new. And this happens all over the world every day, and it's amazing. It is. But we don't really think about it much. When we think about borders, we usually, or at least I usually, think about territorial disputes and war and stuff like that, right? But that is often done on behalf of some far-off king or tyrant. Look, definitely, sometimes there is conflict at the local level. I'm not going to pretend there's not. But on the ground, for the people who live there, borders are often just places where different kinds of people meet, where different cultures meet. And that makes them incredibly fertile soil for innovation. Because what happens when different cultures meet is they exchange ideas, they exchange innovations. And here in our sort of techno-capitalist society in the modern USA, we have narratives about innovation and that it's being done by innovators and it's created by capital. But the main way innovation happens, generally, is someone combining two things that existed but hadn't been combined before. And we see this in art all the time. I grew up watching The Simpsons. That's a very common cultural touchstone. And The Simpsons was innovative because up until that point, cartoons were mostly for little kids. And then The Simpsons came along and said, well, what if we made animation for like grown-ups with a grown-up sense of humor? I don't know if The Simpsons was actually the first to do that. They were the first in my lifetime that sort of caught on. And I know there's a very rich history of animation in other countries, especially in Asia. So you can let me know in the comments if I have any of that wrong. But that's one example, right? Rock and roll grew out of gospel and jazz and R&B, all of the music of black communities in the South. Twitter, much more recent, took text messages, which were 140 characters long at the most, and Twitter said, what if we make them a public conversation instead of a private one? All of these took something that already existed and just reinterpreted it in a new way. right? So innovations happen often when old techniques meet new circumstances. And the most common way to get an old idea to a new circumstance is through cultural exchange. Now, cultures exchange ideas and techniques, and people innovate new ways to incorporate those ideas, right? So a couple episodes ago, I talked about microbes, and I mentioned, ooh, that was a fun little voice crack. I talked about microbes, and I mentioned how someone at some point figured out how to turn grapes into wine, right? Like probably they discovered it by accident. It's how a lot of things happen, is by accident, but they found it and they were like, oh, maybe I can reproduce this. And eventually they made wine. And then there was trade and they taught someone else. And eventually we ended up with different cultures growing grapes in completely different conditions, which led to completely different kinds of wine. Something similar happened, totally different thing, with dumplings. They seem to have originated in the Mongol Empire, right? Genghis Khan. But they spread along the Silk Road, and now pretty much everywhere in the world has something that may have evolved originally from those dumplings. Dumplings got to South Asia, they became momo and samosas, both of which I love. I love food. Dumplings especially. Dumplings got to Eastern Europe, they became pierogies and varniki. Dumplings got to Iberia and they became empanadas. All of these things just evolved. Someone had an initial idea. Someone else said, okay, well, how can I take that idea and sort of fit it to my needs and my context? And we all get dumplings because of it, and I think that's great. All of these things are delicious, right? Last year, this is a fun thing. Last year, Susie's New Year's resolution, this is brilliant, was to eat more dumplings. Literally, she had a couple of them, but one of her New Year's resolutions was eat more dumplings. It is truly one of the most brilliant New Year's resolutions I've ever heard, because it's very easy to stick to, and it also means you get to try lots of different kinds of dumplings. And so anytime we were in a situation where it was like, well, we can eat this, we can eat that, we could have dumplings, and so we had dumplings. And because there are so many kinds of dumplings all around the world, all because of these centuries of cultural exchange, and there are so many dumplings for us to try, right? And this kind of thing happens anywhere that there's trade and cultural exchange, right? Which means it has been happening in border regions like Menton, all the time. It's been happening all the time for hundreds of years. Here's a good one. It was invented in a border region? Freaking nachos. Do you like nachos? I love nachos. Nachos are a very big comfort food here in our household. So, okay. So sort of backing back out, Susie and I have been really lucky, right? We've gotten to travel to, honestly, a bunch of amazing places. We have not been to Menton, but we have found again and again, everywhere we've been, we found that border regions and trade hubs and sort of migratory routes are really amazing. I'll give you another example. So back in 2018, Susie and I traveled to India to go to her cousin's wedding in Bangalore, which is in southern India. Here it is on a map. And the point of this particular tangent isn't to talk about India, but someone more knowledgeable than me about India could do a whole series on the history of cultural exchange in India. Just to give you some examples, India has 22 different official languages that are used by different state governments. There are 31 languages in India with more than 1 million native speakers each. Right? If you only look at the languages where there are 1 million people for whom it's their first language, their native language, there are 31 of them in one country. And most of us in the US where I live, we know nothing about any of it. I looked at the list. I'll link to it here. I looked at the list. I have heard of 10 of these 31 languages. But every one of those languages has its own cultural history that sometimes overlaps with the others, sometimes it doesn't. And so the cultural richness of India is astonishing. But anyway, so we flew to India, and to fly to India, we flew from San Francisco, and we had a layover in Singapore. And my dentist at the time, so we were living in Washington, D.C., my dental hygienist specifically was really excited because she had lived in Singapore for a few years, and she told us about something called Peranakan cuisine. Peranakan? I'm definitely mispronouncing that. I apologize. I love languages, and I am terrible at pronouncing most of them. But Peranakan cuisine, it's also called Nyonya cuisine. I apologize, I don't speak Malay. But it means grandmother cuisine, right? And so it dates back 1,000 years. because there were Chinese migrant families who settled in the Malaysian peninsula and sort of other parts of what is now Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia. And so it's called grandmother cuisine because the women traditionally kept the institutional knowledge about food. And so these families, these migrants, brought their preferred seasoning, they brought ingredients, they brought techniques with them, and then they learned some of the local techniques and ingredients. And over time, they started mixing them. And Singapore, in particular, has been a trade hub for centuries. It's smaller than Rhode Island, but Singapore has 4 official languages. There's Malay, there's Chinese, there's Tamil, and there's English. And so Peranakan cuisine has evolved over time to incorporate ingredients and techniques from other cultures too. And so Peranakan cuisine is a 1,000-year-old fusion that has just been simmering and developing like a really rich broth. And it does not exist anywhere else in the world. I will also tell you the Peranakan restaurant we went to was incredible. The chef is someone named Violet Oon. I think the restaurant was called Violet Oon's. Her food it's unlike anything I have ever had in my life. The specific restaurant we went to is gone. It closed, I think, during lockdown, and it was a pandemic casualty like so many other restaurants. So my point isn't to tell you that this one cuisine is really, really good, though it is. And my point also isn't to define people by their food. I know that people are more than their food, but food is a really easy way for people to innovate and connect across different cultures. Even if you don't have a language in common, you can exchange food. And my point is that when different people coming from different backgrounds have space to get to know each other and to connect and to work together, amazing things happen. Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, and then we'll be right back.
Please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe.
Yes, friends, it is time once again to remind you to like this video, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment or a review, share it with your friends. I appreciate anything you are willing to do to help me get this message out. If you like my shirt, you can get one just like it at goodworld.love. My friend Elaine, who appeared on a previous episode, has worn it in public, and it's been very popular. So you can go to goodworld.love. You can also find links to the Good World on the various social medias. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate you. Okay, so you've probably heard the metaphor of America is a melting pot. Right? Everyone comes in and gets melted together, all these different places. And I don't love that metaphor because it would kind of mean people lose what makes them unique, right? And we all just blend in and we become the same. We become like mass production. And I've also heard people say, well, no, it's more like a salad bowl where there are different ingredients and they're next to each other, but they remain their own thing. But that sort of implies that there's no like mixing at all. And the mixing and the interaction is what helps create all of the richness and the depth along with the variety, again, if we're talking about food. So I have an alternative to propose. If you, like me, were watching American TV in 2009, you may have seen the episode of The Office that begins with Kevin bringing in his famous chili. America is like Kevin's famous chili. Okay, I'll link to the video in the description, but it's a really classic scene. Ooh, hummingbird. Sorry, it's a really great scene, right? Incredible physical comedy, mostly improvised, I think I learned at some point, by Brian Baumgartner, who's the guy who played Kevin. And so there's this voiceover of Kevin talking about how he makes the chili. And Kevin says, everybody is going to get to know each other in the pot. And that is the America I want to live in. Because when you eat a really good chili, you can still taste all the individual ingredients. You can taste the onions, the garlic, the beans, the peppers, the meat if you use meat, tomatoes if you use tomatoes, different seasonings like cumin or oregano. None of those ingredients get lost in the chili. You can taste them all. But together, they make something that is new and different and amazing. And that is what happens when we welcome cultural exchange. That is the world I want to live in. That is the America I want to live in. And by the way, Chili itself has evolved and changed as it moved across cultures and borders. If you love chili con carne, you love the invention that came when someone added European beef to the traditional pepper stews of Tenochtitlan. I will say I really wish we could have had the cultural exchange without all of the mass murder and subjugation, genocide. I wish we could have done without that, but we're here. And to be clear, there's no inherent reason that cultural exchange has to come with violence and trauma. Most cultural exchange around the world throughout history has been through trade. And violence and trauma and cruelty, none of that is inherent to cultural exchange, right? Even in, boy, I'm going to step on a third rail here, but even in Israel and Palestine, there is subjugation and violence, and there's genocide, and there's just absolute atrocity, right? In this place where the land has been conquered and reconquered countless times over thousands of years, the Babylonians, the Romans, it has changed hands a lot. And there are a lot of people who have lived there for a long period of time, not just Jews and Palestinians, plenty of people. And there are these really strong conflicting narratives of not just a right to the land, but an exclusive right to the land, right? And again, it's this land where so many different peoples have these deep historical ties. But even amid all of that, and even in a war zone, there are people who are working together to build a shared future. They're working to melt guns into walking sticks, right? There are people from completely different backgrounds meeting each other on equal footing. They're exchanging ideas, exchanging culture, coming together to build something better. Just for one example, I will link below to the organization Standing Together. I think they are doing great work on the ground, bringing Palestinians and Israelis together and trying to break a really, really entrenched cycle of violence. And as people coming together, creating safety for each other, there is healing magic in that. And that is the power of cultural exchange. There's an idea out there that tries to convince us that what unites a people is a sense of shared history. And look, I'm not going to say shared history doesn't matter, right? The onions in the chili pot, they're all onions, they're not garlic, okay? But no matter our past, we all of us have a shared future. And we can't face that future, we can't build that future if we're only willing to share it with people who have the same past that we do. Like the onions, just going to torture this metaphor for you. The onions may not come from the same patch of soil as the garlic, but they both grew from soil. They're both alliums, they both have a common ancestor, and now they are both in the chili pot together. That's just the reality. They are in it together. Their future is shared. And the same right-wing narrative that I mentioned that obsesses over history, it also tries to divide us based on our differences, right? It pushes the lie that cultural exchange leads to violence, which is what started me talking about this. In fact, the people pushing the narrative generally are the ones pushing for violence, and they're just using cultural exchange as an excuse. Maybe it comes out of something real, right? Maybe they feel threatened by the presence of someone else's culture because they don't know how to share space. But this narrative responds to that by trying to convince us that we need to have a pure society, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean. But violence doesn't come from different people meeting each other. Violence comes from a supremacist mindset, honestly, that claims that we are right and we are just, and it is our job to bend the world to our will. I have been thinking a lot lately about the difference between moral clarity and moral certainty. And I know those sound like the same thing, but I think of them as being different. To me, moral clarity is seeing what is right. Moral certainty is believing that I am right. You see the difference? Moral clarity is seeing that our only path forward is together. Moral certainty is believing that my survival requires your destruction and that prefers to be alone among the ashes rather than being together in the garden. Moral clarity is how we build peace. Moral certainty is how we stay trapped in the cycle of violence. And in our modern, globalized world, the people pushing the violence are often just, honestly, I think, on some level, they are afraid to accept the reality that everything is impermanent, including us, including, by the way, our customs, including the world as we understand it, right? The culture of today is different from the culture of 100 years ago, but that's not a new thing. The culture of 1,000 years ago was different from the culture of 1,100 years ago. Traditions change, though also the good things tend to stick around for a while. But the only constant in our society is change. The only constant on this planet is change. Our world has always been changing from the moment the first cells started reproducing. It's been changing, and it will continue changing long after all of us are gone, long after our entire species is gone. And change can be scary because it reminds us how fragile we are. And so some of us decide that we need to stop the change, right? We need to stand athwart the train of history and yell stop, as though you can stand in front of a train and shout stop and it'll work. And so people decide they need to stop the change, and they look for someone to blame, and they try to pursue some imagined idea of purity, as though we aren't all descended from the same ancestors, as though we aren't all cousins, which we are. They ignore the truth, by the way, that who counts as pure just gets made up anew every time someone decides to define who is us and who is them. Purity is a myth, friends. And also, if it actually were real, it would be harmful. Like in nature, if you breathe pure oxygen, it will kill you. If you purified your body by killing all the bacteria, your body would shrivel up and you would die. You depend on those things. So stop wasting your time drawing boundaries around who gets to matter and start asking people what matters to them. The actual world, the one we live in, is a world of change, and that is a good thing because change is how innovation happens. Meeting people where they are instead of where we think they should be is how the world gets better. And when I talk about the good world, the name of the show, I'm not imagining a world where there's no disease, there's no death, there's no change. I'm just imagining a world where we stop trying to control each other or exclude each other. A world where we stop pretending there are fixed lines everywhere when literally everything is in flux, from the atoms that make up our bones to the borders that define our governments. I am talking about a world where we accept our grief. Our grief is the price we pay for living and loving as a conscious spirit in a temporary body. And accepting those hard things is how we open ourselves up to the bottomless richness all around us. And few places embody that bottomless richness like the border regions, the crossroads, the trades routes, the migration hubs where people from different branches of our one human family tree that we are all on, the places where those people are meeting each other, as they have done for centuries, as they have done for all of history. Sometimes they move across the border, sometimes the border moves across them, but when they are able to celebrate their differences, all of us are richer for it. Okay, we are going to end there. Oh, I am accidentally hitting my ukulele very hard. Sorry. I don't know if I'm apologizing to you or to the ukulele. It's just a habit. Sorry for existing. Sorry. Well, thank you, friends, for your visit today. Now it's time we both go on our way. The world will still be insane tomorrow, but don't let that fill your heart with sorrow. You can thrive in a desert, just ask a saguaro. Please give to my Patreon. Capitalism is fun. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults. Bye, friends. Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here.